The Falcons signed free agent safety Jordan Fuller. What is he adding to the defense, and how does this change their draft plans?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. So if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. the iron that sharpens the iron, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, 18 years, almost going on 19 years. Formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that goes strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And today's episode is a mailbag episode. We'll answer listener questions sort of on what is the ceiling for the Falcons if they have a top 5 offense this year under the Lisan Al-Gaib, Michael Penix. Is David Onyemata still going to be on this team come week 1? Some other questions that we'll be answering, as well as talking about how today's free agent signing of Jordan Fuller, impacts the Falcons draft plans and sort of my expectations for what the Falcons draft plans are likely to be. But let's start the conversation talking about the long time coming signing of free agent safety Jordan Fuller. I talked about him last year as one of several potential options for the Falcons to sign in free agency to tag team with Jesse Bates last season. I recently re-listened to an episode I did with Daniel Flick of Sports Illustrated, talking about, and Daniel mentioned Jordan Fuller as a likely option for the Falcons in free agency, as opposed to a Justin Simmons at that point in time. It's just funny, no offense to Daniel when it comes to that guy, but the Falcons always zig when you expect them to zag, and so it felt like it was a slam dunk that the Falcons were going to attack that safety position last year in free agency. They did not until, making that Justin Simmons signing in August, thanks in part to a DeMarco Hellams injury. And we sat here, a week plus now into free agency, and we're like, are the Falcons going to punt on this position again for the second year in a row? And today we got our answer is no. By signing Jordan Fuller, they're getting a player that Raheem Morris is very familiar with. He spent 3 years playing under Raheem Morris in LA, 5-year starter. He was the team captain in Raheem's first year. In 2021, he wore the green dot during that season, calling the defense for the team. By all accounts, a smart, high character player, capable run defender. Coverage, I think he's solid in coverage, but I think the main limitation with Jordan Fuller is he's not like a great athlete. And so when you put him sort of in space against, fast, explosive wide receivers, he can kind of get exposed from time to time just because he's not going to be a guy that is going to be that sort of elite athlete and whatnot in that regard. But he's a smart player and usually will put himself in a position to be successful, as he did several years with the Rams. The biggest knock, I think, on Fuller is the durability concerns. He's basically missed roughly a third of the potential games he can play in over the last 5 years. He missed 4 games as a rookie in 2020 with a shoulder injury. He missed 14 games in 2022 with a hamstring injury. He missed 8 games last year with the Carolina Panthers with a hamstring injury. I guess the good thing is that all those injuries seem to occur in even years, and so this is an odd year, so he'll probably be healthy this year based off of how the last 5 years have gone. So I think we can look at this move primarily as a stopgap signing, just like every other Falcons defensive addition or re-signing has been this offseason. We don't quite know what the terms are with the Jordan Fuller move. I'm going to assume it's a 1-year deal. He signed a 1-year deal worth $3.25 million last year with the Panthers, which was part of the reason why it was like, you couldn't sign this guy for like dirt cheap last year, but I'm going to assume it's a similar type of deal this year with the Falcons. And this is just another indication that the Falcons, are treating this offseason like 2022 rather than a 2023 offseason. that 2022 offseason, the Falcons had a lot of dead money to take on from Matt Ryan, about $40 million. And then they made a lot of sort of low-key short-term signings. This year, they got a lot of dead money potentially to absorb with Kirk Cousins and are making a lot of more low-key short-term signings. And as we discussed on yesterday's episode, everything is telling us that the Falcons are playing it that sort of conservatively like they did in 2022 with the idea of, hey, after the 2022 season going into 2023, the Falcons were a lot more aggressive, pushing their chips into the middle of the table, making those significant upgrades on the defense side of the ball and spending a lot of money. And it seems like that's what the Falcons are preparing to do, this year and then do that in 2026. And as I discussed on yesterday's episode, the big question is, will this regime be still around in 2026? And obviously, a lot of that will depend on what type of results they get on the football field this year. But you just kind of look at how much guaranteed money they spent in those offseasons. Like 2022, they spent $10 million in guaranteed money on 11 defensive free agents, including new additions and re-signings. It's about $1 million per free agent in terms of guaranteed money. In 2023, that number jumped to $96 million guaranteed on about 10 defensive free agents, so about $10 million per. And so far, based off of the 6 defensive free agent contracts that we know of, according to overthecap.com, the Falcons have spent $29 million on 6 defensive free agents. So that's about $5 million per. So that right now, that's about in the middle, but that's not factoring 4 more free agents like Jordan Fuller, Morgan Fox, Kentavious Street, and Mike Ford that we don't have the full details on. My guesstimation is that number is going to be, in terms of guaranteed money, somewhere for those 4 guys, somewhere in that $8 million range combined, give or take a million or so. And so that would then push that number for the 10 defensive free agents, if that's accurate, somewhere between like $3.5 to $4 million. So a little bit closer to the 2022 end of the spectrum than the 2023 end of the spectrum. And for obvious reasons, as I have discussed so much over the last 2+ months, my hope was that the Falcons would take more of that. I figured they weren't going to go to the same degree that they did in 2023, but I've hoped, that would be on closer, that number would be, 6-7 million per or whatever, if you want to put it like that, as opposed to, 3 to 4 million per in the middle. So, that 2022 Falcons team with Terry Fontenot as the GM and Arthur Smith as a second-year head coach, I think had a longer leash than the team does now, with Terry Fontenot still as a GM and Raheem Morris as a second-year coach. But we'll see how it all plays out. Like, my current expectations is this team is probably going to win 7 or 8 games this year. I think there's the possibility they could win less. There's possibility they could win more, right? And obviously we're hopeful that they win more than that, and a lot of that will depend on Penix balling out. And it's just kind of funny because all throughout January, you heard me on this podcast basically say, hey guys, the one thing we're not going to do over the next 6 months is hype you guys up and tell you that Michael Penix is going to be the savior. And because March has not gone the way that we have gone, I've done a complete 80 on that. And I'm like, hey guys, maybe Michael Penix is going to be the savior. And it's really all we got at this point in time, unless the Falcons can make a big splash move to really move the needle on the defense. That's potentially a Trey Hendrickson trade, as we've discussed a bunch, and we'll discuss a little bit more later today on the episode. And if that does happen, we'll have to walk back some things. We'll have to walk back, some of our Terry Fontenot slander. There's recent rumors that, maybe the Falcons can get a 3rd-round pick for Kirk Cousins. I'll believe it when I see it. But if they do that, then, I'm going to have to walk back a lot of Terry Fontenot slander. And we're going to have to put a headshot of Terry Fontenot on the goat wall behind me, right? We got enough space right here for a headshot of Terry Fontenot. If he can steal a 3rd-round pick for Kirk Cousins, and also potentially pull off a Trey Hendrickson trade, then yeah, that man deserves a spot on the wall. It is the greatest heist. It's the Lufthansa heist, to borrow from Goodfellas or whatever. It was, it's the greatest heist that you've ever seen. But we'll see on that front. And a lot of people are now wondering, what does the Jordan Fuller move do for the Falcons draft plans? And we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So scaling your business requires the right expertise at the right time. And with Upwork, you can find specialized freelancers, in marketing, development, design, and more, experts ready to help you take your business to the next level. Upwork gives businesses flexibility by connecting them with top freelance talent across multiple industries, including IT, AI, web development, and marketing. Whether you need extra hands for a project or a long-term partner, Upwork makes hiring simple and affordable. Posting a job is free and simple, and within a day, with multiple qualified candidates to choose from, that's how fast Upwork works. So if you want to take advantage of these offers, make sure you visit upwork.com right now and post your job for free. That's upwork.com, upwork.com, to connect with top talent and grow your business today. And there's nothing like experience watching your favorite teams live and in person, and getting tickets shouldn't be stressful to see those teams. That's where Game Time comes in, making it easier than ever to grab last-minute seats at unbeatable prices. Whether it's sports, comedy, music, theater, whatever event is near you, Game Time is making it easier to get tickets thanks to their new feature, Game Time Picks. This feature is going to filter out the fluff and show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. With seat views before you buy, no surprise fees at checkout, and the lowest price guarantee, you can book with total confidence and peace of mind. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. That's LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So let's talk a little bit more about how this move potentially moves the needle for the Falcons in the draft. Got a couple of listener questions from the Locked On Falcons Insiders. Justin as how have the free agent moves altered your draft expectations, if at all? And Rob asked, does the Jordan Fuller signing remove Starks as an option? Could it mean cornerback more likely, Barron or Will Johnson? So I do think linebacker and safety with the Divine Diablo and now Jordan Fuller signings become less likely for the Falcons in round one. I've talked before a little bit about positional value and why you would want to avoid those two positions. And I know, people are like, well, you didn't want to talk about positional value when the Falcons took a tight end and a running back in the top 10 drafts. And to me, again, I feel like that was different because of Arthur Smith's offense needing to have dudes at those skilled position players in order to make it work, as I've explained before, whether it was Derrick Henry or A.J. Brown, and obviously in Atlanta with the top 10 picks they used on those skilled position players, like his offense needs dudes, to basically beat the guys. And what I mean by that, if you're not following me, is like, Derrick Henry, you hand the ball off to Derrick Henry, or you hand the ball off another running back, it's a 5-yard gain. With Derrick Henry, it's a 40-yard gain. And that's the same sort of concept with Bijan. And the same thing where you have AJ Brown takes a 12-yard dig for a 40-yard gain. That's what I mean. Dudes, guys that can take simple plays and make them into big plays because they're just that good. I don't think the positional value stuff really applies to the defense. Like, Raheem throughout his time, in LA, was mostly working with replacement level linebackers at those spots, right? Minus Bobby Wagner and like one good year from Ernest Jones. And as we learned last year, having two quote unquote plus safeties with Justin Simmons and Jesse Bates didn't really, move the needle for this scheme to the degree that we thought it would, right? That basically the engine for this defense and most defenses in the NFL is, who do you have up front? Who do you have at cornerback? And so those premium positions are what matters. And basically good players at those positions rarely make it to free agency. So if you don't draft those guys, it's very hard for you to improve at those positions. And we see the contrast to that, where good players at D tackle, linebacker, and safety make it to free agency all the time. Now, D tackle is a little bit of an exception when it comes to those less premium positions, just because a really good D tackle can affect the quarterback is considered a premium position, as opposed to a D tackle that's more of a 2-down run stopper is not, right? That's kind of how you split that. But to me, because of that, like using first round picks on linebackers and safeties makes little sense. Unless you think that player is special. Basically, you need to find people say don't take a running back in the first round unless he's Bijan Robinson or Jahmyr Gibbs, right? And I put Jahmyr Gibbs in that category because I know we didn't talk a lot about Jahmyr Gibbs in the lead up to that 2023 draft, but I thought Jahmyr Gibbs was a special, exceptional running back. I just knew he was never a realistic option for the Falcons. If the Falcons were to take a running back in the first round, it was going to be Bijan Robinson, not Gibbs. But I remember a Discord user asked me in the lead up to that draft, it's like, Aaron, I know you love Bijan, but where will you stack Gibbs? And I'm like, he's like 90% the player of Bijan Robinson. If Bijan is a generational player, that's 90% generational for Jahmyr Gibbs. So I had a great affinity for Jahmyr Gibbs. So that is not hindsight. That is, to me, it was like, yeah, this guy was going to be really good in the league. But, I think the fact that the Falcons have prioritized getting a linebacker and getting a safety now, to me, is smart. That, to me, I don't think there's any of that sort of generational, special, whatever you want to call it, talent at the linebacker position. I think Jahad Campbell of Alabama, the linebacker, is good. But to me, if I'm going to take a linebacker in the first round, an off-ball linebacker, like I want Roquan Smith. And if we're comparing Jahad Campbell on the Georgia linebacker spectrum with Roquan at the high end and say Quay Walker at the lower end, like to me, Jahad Campbell's closer to Quay Walker, if you ask me. I know other people may feel differently. Safety, I'm a fan of Malachi Starks, the Georgia safety. But as I said, I don't really think he has first-round traits. Nick Emanwori, the South Carolina safety that some people think is better than Malachi Starks. Falcons have a top 30 visit scheduled with him in the coming weeks. I'm not that big a fan of Emanwori. I think his film is pretty average. I think the most intriguing thing about him is athleticism and traits, and I don't think athleticism matters all that much at the safety position. I told somebody on Twitter the other day that, like, to me, Emanwori is like a tall version of Richie Grant. Like, I don't think his film is any better than Richie Grant's film, and I thought Richie Grant was like a third or fourth round talent. But we'll see on that. So, even though I don't think Fuller and Diablo are needle movers at linebacker and safety, I think adding those guys makes a ton of sense, and it allows the Falcons to focus on using their premium draft picks on premium positions. Right. I'd be extremely frustrated if the Falcons use either one of their top two selections in rounds 1 or 2 on a linebacker or safety, personally. But that's just me. Now, to me, the exception to that is Jahdae Barron, the Texas corner, because I think I see him more long-term as a safety in the NFL, but I think at least initially he can be a nickel corner. So it's a safety with an asterisk if he's the first round pick, like similar to Brian Branch, who came into the league as a nickel corner and then in year 2 transitioned to a safety. That's kind of what I could see Barron being. And so I think Barron is one of 5 players that is in the mix at 15. Before the Fuller signing, I thought there were 5 players that I would have bet money that the Falcons would take in round 1 at pick 15. Jalen Walker out of Georgia, Mikael Williams out of Georgia, Donovan Ezeraku out of Boston College. Those 3 guys are all edge rushers. Jahdae Barron out of Texas and Malachi Starks out of Georgia. But now with the Fuller signing, I would probably bump Starks off that list, or at least lower on that list. And I would probably replace him with the 5th guy being Kenneth Grant, the Michigan D tackle / nose tackle. And I should say, and this is going to sound like I'm throwing shade at the Falcons, which I guess I am, but not to the degree it makes it sound what I'm about to say makes it sound like. I'm basing that purely off of logic, guys. I'm taking a very logical approach to the draft. And we know, historically speaking, that the Falcons draft plans are not always that logical as we want them to be. And again, we'll see on that. But when I look at the Falcons' current roster, projecting the 48-man roster, I think there are 6 spots where you have legit upgrade opportunities currently on the roster. The 3rd tight end, who right now is Nikola Kalinic right now, and I'm sure 90% of you are like, who? Right? And like, that's exactly my point. Although there's now reports that Felipe Franks may be making his triumphant return to the Falcons, according to D. Orlando Ledbetter of the AJC. So I will enjoy that very much if we get to talk about that with Jarvis on tomorrow's episode. So I'm getting a kick out of that. But, tight end 3, the starting center, as we discussed yesterday, it does feel like the Falcons are more and more comfortable with Ryan Newsel than I would personally be. But I think there's still definite room for an upgrade there. Edge rusher, I think, is the obvious one where there's an upgrade. Nose tackle, right now, if the season started today, it would either be LaCale London or Kentavious Street starting at that spot. So to me, there's obvious need for upgrade. That's where Kenneth Grant comes into the mix. CB3, that nickel cornerback spot right now, again, Clark Phillips or Natron Brooks would probably be their top options currently on the roster. And so I think that's a spot that needs upgrade. And then you need another safety, even though you sign Jordan Fuller, because right now your 4th safety is Benny Sapp. And so getting another body there that you can potentially develop as a long-term option to me makes sense as well. So as things sit here today, I would project that with the Falcons currently only having 5 picks, and obviously we're hoping for trade backs and all these various things to add more assets and whatnot. But if I was to limit the Falcons in terms of the 5 positions that I would expect, and again, this is the logical approach, I would expect, not in this order, but tight end, D tackle, edge rusher, nickel cornerback, and safety, right? And that's based heavily off of the fact that when you look at the current like 70-ish players, or something that they have, I think there's like 74 players on the contract right now. And you look at the 90-man roster that they carried into training camp last year, those are the 5 positions where they need to add at least 2 or more players to reach the same number that they had at the 90-man roster. There's a lot of positions where they could add, like quarterback is one position where they need to, they carried 4 quarterbacks on the roster last year. They only have 3 currently on the roster with Penix, Cousins, and Emory Jones. I expect them to add a quarterback, but I don't think that's going to be a drafted position. If they're going to add a quarterback, it's either going to be a veteran free agent or an undrafted free agent is basically what I'm at. So that's where that logical approach comes from it, whereas it's like you need multiple bodies at 5 spots: tight end, nose tackle, edge rusher, nickel corner, and safety. And so right now, those are the positions that I think the Falcons will prioritize in the draft. And there are other positions like off-ball linebacker, center, et cetera, that I could see the Falcons drafting, particularly if they add more draft picks. But I don't think those positions are going to be the priorities right now in terms of quote unquote need. But we know the Falcons take a best player available, air quotes, best player available, which is a nebulous term because it's like, it's very selective how that applies, but we will see on that front. So I hope that answers your question in terms of my vision for what the Falcons draft plans on. We got more questions from the various Locked On Falcons insiders, including what is this team's potential ceiling if they have a top 5 offense this year under Michael Penix. And we'll get into all of that, guys, as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons.
The NCAA tournament is here, and so is the bracket breakdown.
Locked On Podcast Network and Amazon Fire TV channels are teaming up to deliver NCAA tournament coverage like never before. Watch studio shows featuring former players and Locked On's local experts as they guide you through every upset, buzzer beater, and bracket matchup.
Stream it all for free on Amazon Fire TV channel. Search Bracket Breakdown to see it all for free.
It's your team every day.
So we got a lot of mailbag questions from Locked On Falcons insiders, and they get priority when it comes to these mailbag questions. So if you want to get priority on future mailbags that we'll be having, of course, you can become a Locked On Falcons insider at the link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. You get a 14-day free trial. Then it's $4.99 a month after that. Not only do you get priority on mailbag questions, you also get access to my film breakdowns, pre-draft breakdowns. We got a free agent group of breakdowns that are coming in the next couple of days. I don't know if I'll add Jordan Fuller yet to that list, but that will probably be next week. And then obviously once the draft is over, we'll have post-draft and focusing on the Falcons draft picks as well. So, and then probably when we get closer to training camp, we'll do some like offensive breakdowns and talk about some of the ways that Zach Robinson will expand and improve this offense, and Michael Penix and all that stuff. So a lot of things to look forward to, as a Locked On Falcons insider in the coming months. So a lot of content coming your way. But our first questions come from Cody. He asks, how far can this Falcons team go if we have a top 5 offense, but still a bottom of the league defense? And Cameron C asks a similar question, is with what we have on both sides of the ball as of now, do you think for us to be successful, we would need to score over 28 points per game to get a win, given our schedule of teams we play this year? So I'm grouping these together because basically scoring 28 points per game is essentially a top 5 offense. So to answer Cameron's question, yes, I do think so. Talked a lot over the years about how team success is driven by offensive firepower. When you look at the teams that win the most games in the regular season and those that go the furthest in the postseason, they typically are top 10 offenses as opposed to top 10 defenses. Basically, the idea that offense wins championships in today's NFL as opposed to defense wins championship. But, the best teams, we got to caveat that by saying the best teams do multiple things well, right? Passing is more important than running the football, but the best teams tend to be able to do both at a high level. And offense is more important than defense, but the best teams tend to do both at a high level. So that is, it's not to sit here and say that defense doesn't matter, but it is the sort of the tiebreaker between two good offenses. The team that has the better defense usually is going to be the victor in that regard. So that's how you got to think about it. But to answer Cody's question, I look back at DVOA rankings since 2017, the last time the Falcons made the playoffs. And when you say bottom of the league defense, I'm assuming that you're referring to like a bottom 10 defense, right? Which right now I think the Falcons are likely to have. But there are basically only, since 2017, there have been only 4 teams that had a top 5 offense and a bottom 10 defense. That was last year's Bengals team, the 21 Chargers, the 20 Titans, and the 2018 Chiefs. All 4 of those teams had winning records. They averaged about 10.6 wins across those seasons. 2 of those 4 teams made the playoffs. The Titans lost in the wild card round. The Chiefs lost in the championship round. If we look at a top 10 offense with a bottom 10 defense, there have been 12 teams. Last year's Commanders, last year's Rams, the 23 Packers, the 23 Eagles, the 22 Lions, the 22 Falcons, mostly because of how dominant their run game boosted their DVOA ranking that year. They were 8th in DVOA, primarily because of the run game. The 22 Jaguars, the 20 Vikings, the 19 Chargers, the 19 Raiders, the 18 Panthers, and the 18 Packers. Only half of those 12 teams had winning records. They averaged about 8.5 wins. 5 of the 12 made the playoffs. 1 loss in the wild card, 3 lost in the divisional round, and 1 loss in the championship round this past year's Washington team. So basically, if the Falcons have a top 5 offense, regardless of how bad the defense, they should finish with a winning record based off of recent history. Of course, we know that the Falcons love the Falcon, and so they'll be the one team with the top 5 offense and a bottom 10 defense that manages to only win 7 games or something like that. But if it's just a top 10 offense, which I think is probably the more realistic expectation for this offense, even though I do feel like that's still an optimistic expectation for this offense, but is more realistic than the top 5 one. That's probably going to be more likely to be another losing season, which again, that's why I said earlier, it feels like this team is still probably going to be a 7 or 8 win team. Now, in terms of how far they could go if they do have that top 5 offense, it does feel like that's probably a second round playoff team. Obviously, Washington and Kansas City made it further, and I think a lot of that had to do with the quarterback play. So if Michael Penix balls out and looks like one of the top 5 to 8 quarterbacks in the NFL this year, then that the Falcons can go further than the second round of the playoffs with a top 5 offense. Obviously, the year that the Chiefs went to the championship game with a top 5 offense and a bottom 10 defense, Mahomes won the MVP that year in 2018. And then obviously Jaden Daniels last year won Offensive Rookie of the Year and got a couple of 4th and 5th place votes as an MVP last year for that. So that kind of tells you that it's, Michael Penix is going to drive this bus if the Falcons are going to have that caliber of season. Our next question is, do you think David Onyemata is on the roster week 1, or are they waiting to release him for some reason? That comes from Isaiah S. It does appear that he's going to be around. I struggle to see why. Again, as I've said, like, why would the Falcons balk at having a 32-year-old Grady Jarrett who counts $20 million against the cap coming off a much better season, but be okay with a 33-year-old David Onyemata counting $17 million against the cap coming off a worse season? Like, it doesn't math. The math ain't mathing. But, the only rhyme or reason is that Terry Fontenot just hates dead money and looked at Grady Jarrett only counting $4 million against as far as dead money, and Onyemata counting roughly $9 million, or now I think it's more than $9 million in terms of dead money if the Falcons were to cut him. The Falcons, just learned that the Onyemata had a $500,000 roster bonus due the same day that Kirk Cousins' roster bonus was, and that deadline has passed. So it seems like if you were going to move on from David Onyemata, you would have cut him by now. Now, maybe it's a similar situation that we learned last year with Taylor Heineke, who had a similar deadline. And then we learned like 2 weeks after the deadline that, he had actually restructured his contract ahead of the deadline and changed some things. And maybe we find out something similar with David Onyemata, but it feels like the Falcons are ready to roll with David Onyemata. And again, nothing against David Onyemata. I'm just like, he didn't do anything last year that makes you go like, oh, this guy definitely needs to come back. So it's fascinating that that's the choice that the Falcons made. And I feel like, again, feels like something should happen, but based off of how the last 10 days have gone, it seems like they're comfortable keeping David Onyemata. So we'll see. Rob, our last question comes from Robbie. As how realistic is a Parsons or Trey trade? And do you think we add another wide receiver to the room? If so, what body type do you think? Parsons trade, I don't think is realistic yet. As I said in a previous episode, the Cowboys really have no incentive to trade him at this point in time. With a 5th-year option this year and a franchise tag the year after, they will owe him like $54 million over the next 2 years if they do nothing, right? And, it wouldn't be exactly if they signed him to like a $40 million a year contract to match the Myles Garrett deal that they would owe him like $80 million over the next couple of years. But it would be probably more than they currently would owe him with the 5th-year option and that franchise tag. And the Cowboys have historically slow played giving their prime players extension. We saw it twice with Dak Prescott. We saw it with CeeDee Lamb. It's mostly because Jerry Jones loves the drama. And now that, Micah Parsons is apparently beefing with current and former teammates, at least based off of the tweets, Jerry is absolutely going to milk that drama for all it's worth as long as he possibly can. So I think a Micah Parsons trade is possible, but I don't think it's going to happen in the year of 2025. Maybe it happens in the year 2026, maybe. But wouldn't be shocked if it's something that happens in 2027, just because of how the Cowboys operate, that they're just going to drag this out for as long as possibly can, just because it's going to get eyeballs. Basically, that's how they do it. So, as I explained the other day, Rob, so-called Locked On Falcons Insider, so-called every day, we did talk about the Trey Hendrickson trade remaining a possibility. In terms of how realistic it is, depends on what your worldview is. Are you an optimist or are you a pessimist, right? How realistic it is. I think it's possible. I definitely think it's possible that the Bengals still trade Trey Hendrickson. Whether that's to the Falcons, we'll see. Again, I don't tend to think that the Falcons, if Cincinnati does trade Trey Hendrickson, which I think at this point is probably like 50-50, I don't think the Falcons are at the front of that line, but we'll just sort of have to see about that. So we'll see. And no, I don't think the Falcons will add to their wide receiver room. They already have 11 wide receivers currently on the roster, so maybe they bring in another camp body or undrafted free agent. Hopefully it will be someone with a little bit of juice on the outside. But other than that, I'm not expecting the Falcons to really tweak their wide receiver core. So let's see. Do we have time for one more? We'll answer Ron Mexico's question. He says, what positions as player do you expect to make the biggest jump this year, excluding Penix? We already know he's pumping. So if we're excluding Penix, I'm kind of hoping it's going to be it's going to be one of these 4 players, in terms of if one of these 4 players makes a big jump, I think it has the most impact on the team. That's Arnold Ebiketie, Zach Harrison, Matthew Bergeron, or Kyle Pitts. Those are, to me, the 4 guys that I think have the most upside in terms of making a jump and have the most growth potential to feel like it's a possibility that they can make a big jump. I'm sure there are other players that I can name, but I don't feel as optimistic or hopeful, let's say, even in the ones where I'm not that optimistic that these 4 guys, but I'm most hopeful that one of those 4 guys will make that jump. So I hope that answers your question, Ron. But we had a lot of questions from the Locked On Falcons insiders. If you want to submit yours, of course, you can join at that link in the description below. Tomorrow, we should be joined by Jarvis Davis to talk about, all the big headlines from this week, and we'll get, we'll see what else, we'll see what Jarvis has to think about Felipe Franks. That's we are so back, baby. We are back. All right, guys. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen by checking us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, and check out the Locked On NFL Draft podcast to hear Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez, disagree with me and tell you that Nick Emmanwori is a superstar in the making at the safety position. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.